Chapter 1. The Iron Coast. The rain was lashing against the windows of the trailer where the most powerful man in the Allied military sat alone. It was the night of June the 5th, 1944. The air was thick with tension, heavier than the cigarette smoke that hung in the room. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower picked up his fountain pen. His hand was steady, but the weight of the moment was crushing. He wasn't writing a final order or a rousing speech. He was writing a confession. On a small slip of paper, he penned the words, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded the note, accepting in advance the responsibility for the greatest catastrophe in military history. This was the burden he carried as 156,000 men waited in the churning seas. They were sailing towards an enemy who had spent 4 years preparing their welcome. This was the Atlantic Wall, a concrete monster stretching across the coastline. Under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Germans had studied the beaches of Normandy with jagged steel hedgehogs, mined obstacles, and millions of anti-personnel mines. Every meter of sand was zeroed in by machine guns concealed within reinforced bunkers. Rommel's philosophy was simple: stop them at the water's edge. If they gain a foothold, they will win the war. The pressure on Eisenhower was overwhelming. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses and demanded relief, a second front to draw Hitler's divisions west. If this invasion, Operation Overlord, failed, the alliance would fracture. There was no guarantee that the combined industrial might of the United States and Britain could ever mount a second attempt. The war in Europe could drag on for years or even be lost. The stakes were absolute. The invasion had already been delayed 24 hours due to relentless storms. Now the chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, had detected a tiny, temporary, terrifying window of calm, a brief interlude between cyclones. It was a gamble against the weather, against the sea, and against the implacable defenses of the Third Reich. Eisenhower looked at his corps commanders. There was no room for hesitation or debate. To wait meant losing the crucial element of surprise that Operation Fortitude had brought them. To wait meant certain storms would sink the fleet. He took one last drag from his cigarette. The fate of the free world rested on 4 simple words. He gave the order. "Okay, let's go." The largest armada ever assembled began to churn the grey, cold waters of the English Channel. It stretched for 60 miles, a shadow crossing the darkness toward the shores of France. The journey was underway, and the terrible secret that allowed this impossible venture to begin was still perfectly intact. The enemy knew an invasion was coming, but they were scanning the wrong horizon. Chapter 2. The Great Deception. The invasion fleet was on the water, but the true masterstroke of D-Day had already been delivered not by steel or fire, but by deception and lies. To the German High Command, the greatest secret of the war was not if the Allies would invade, but where. Logic dictated one answer: Pas de Calais. It was the narrowest point of the English Channel, offering the shortest possible route to Germany's industrial heartland. Hitler believed it. His field marshals believed it. They had reinforced it, turning that section of the Atlantic Wall into an almost impenetrable defensive fortress. The Allies, knowing the German obsession with logic and the shortest distance, decided to feed that obsession. The lie they constructed was called Operation Fortitude. It was the most elaborate game of military theatre ever staged, designed to convince the enemy that the main assault force was poised to strike directly across from Dover, bypassing Normandy completely. The creation was the first United States Army Group, or FUSAG. FUSAG was a ghost army. Based in the southeast of England, the sprawling camps contained not battalions of hardened soldiers, but acres of painted canvas and elaborate papier-mâché. Its tanks were made of rubber, inflated each morning by ground crews. Its landing craft were wooden and flimsy. Yet FUSAG was given the loudest, most professional radio traffic of any Allied command. Operators simulated the chatter of thousands of men, sending coded messages that spoke confidently of their upcoming role in the main invasion. They were acting for an audience of one, the German listening posts. To command this phantom force, the Allies chose the single American general Hitler feared above all others, George S. Patton. Patton was a legend, a brilliant, aggressive commander whose very presence suggested an imminent, decisive strike. For months, Patton was forced to play the decoy, making highly publicized, visible visits to the FUSAG camps. He was denied a command in the real invasion, a bitter personal blow, but his public movements served their purpose. The German intelligence, desperate for validation, tracked Patton's every movement and concluded that where Patton was, the main force must surely follow. But the cornerstone of the entire edifice of deception was the network of double agents known as the double-cross system. At the center stood Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the British as Agent Garbo. Garbo was a Spanish Republican who hated the fascists so much he volunteered to spy for the British. He was so brilliant, so utterly convincing, that he managed to create an entire fictional network of 27 sub-agents across Britain, all of whom were feeding misinformation to the Abwehr, the German intelligence service. Garbo played his final critical hand in the hours immediately before the Normandy invasion. As the real armada sailed, Garbo sent a series of urgent, increasingly distressed messages to his German handler, insisting that this was merely a diversionary attack. He claimed his fictional agents were tied up, unable to get timely intelligence, but he was certain the main force, Patton's FUSAG, was still preparing for Calais. The message landed exactly as intended. It played straight into the ingrained German belief that the attack on Normandy was a feint. The critical result was the most devastating strategic blunder of the war. Hitler refused to release his two vital Panzer Reserve divisions, believing they needed to be held ready for the real invasion at Calais. This monumental act of psychological warfare meant that when the men hit the beaches of Normandy on June the 6th, they faced only the static, dug-in divisions of the Atlantic Wall. The powerful German armoured forces that could have counterattacked and pushed the Allies back into the sea were held idle, waiting for a ghost army commanded by a decoy general to land on a fictional schedule. It was an espionage masterstroke. The greatest lie ever told bought the Allies the crucial few hours they needed, and without it, D-Day would have been doomed. Chapter 3. Logistics of the Impossible. Deception had bought the Allies time, but it could not buy them a harbour. This was the fundamental paradox of D-Day. To sustain an invasion force of this magnitude, the Allies needed to offload 7,000 tons of vehicles and supplies every single day. In 1944, there was only one way to do that: a deep-water port with cranes, breakwaters, and docks. The Germans knew this. It was why they had turned every major French port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, into a fortress. They knew that an army landing on a beach without a port would eventually run out of fuel and ammunition. They could simply wait for the Allies to starve on the sand. So the British engineers proposed a solution so audacious that many commanders initially thought it was a joke. If they couldn't capture a port, they would bring one with them. These were the Mulberry harbours. Constructed in secret across the UK, these were massive prefabricated concrete caissons, some as tall as a 6-story building and weighing 6,000 tons each. The plan was to tow these concrete monsters across the volatile English Channel and sink them in position off the coast of Normandy. Once connected by miles of floating steel roadways codenamed Wales, they would create a fully functional harbour the size of Dover in a matter of days. It was a logistical feat that rivaled the pyramids in scale, executed on moving water under enemy fire. But getting the supplies to the beach was only half the problem. The beach itself was a weapon. The Atlantic Wall was not just concrete bunkers. It was the terrain. The Germans had laid millions of mines, and the sand itself was soft and treacherous. A standard 30-ton tank attempting to land would likely bog down or be blown apart before it fired a shot. Enter Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart was an eccentric military engineer who believed that for every problem on the beach, there was a machine that could solve it. His creations were officially known as the 79th Armoured Division, but to the men who saw them, they were simply Hobart's Funnies. He took the standard Sherman and Churchill tanks and mutated them. He built the Crab, a tank fitted with a rotating drum of heavy chains that thrashed the ground ahead of it, detonating mines harmlessly to clear a safe path for the infantry. He built the Crocodile, a terrified beast that replaced its hull machine gun with a flamethrower capable of firing a jet of liquid fire 120 yards into the slit of a German bunker. He built the Bobbin, a tank that carried a massive spool of canvas carpet, laying its own road over the soft sand so the trucks behind it wouldn't sink. And finally, the most ambitious and risky invention of all, the Duplex drive tank, or Donald Duck. The engineers wrapped a canvas screen around the hull of a Sherman tank, filled it with air, and added propellers. It turned a 33-ton machine of war into a boat. The plan was to launch them miles offshore. They would swim in low in the water, a surprise armoured force that would emerge from the surf alongside the first wave of infantry to suppress the German guns. On the British beaches, these Funnies would prove to be the difference between victory and stalemate. But on the American beaches, particularly Omaha, the ambition of the technology would collide with the brutal reality of the weather. The logistics of the impossible were about to be tested against the chaos of the real world. Chapter 5. Chaos in the dark. Before the first boot touched the sand, the invasion began in the sky. At 23 hours on June 5th, the engines of over 1,000 C-47 transport planes roared to life. Inside sat 13,000 American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions and 6,000 men of the British 6th Airborne. Their mission was critical: drop behind the Atlantic Wall in the dead of night, seize the bridges, and stop the German reinforcements from rushing the beaches. But as the armada of planes crossed the coastline, the plan disintegrated. A thick bank of clouds blinded the pilots. Then the German anti-aircraft guns opened up. The sky turned into a kaleidoscope of tracers and flak explosions. Panic set in. Pilots, desperate to evade the fire, broke formation. They throttled up, flying too fast and too low. Inside the planes, the jumpmasters screamed, "Go, go, go!" and men threw themselves into the pitch black, often miles from their drop zones. The drop was a catastrophe. Men landed in flooded fields, dragged under the water by the weight of their own gear, drowning without ever seeing the enemy. Others landed in town squares, hanging helplessly from church steeples as German patrols used them for target practice. Equipment was lost, Radios were smashed. Private Ken Russell of the 82nd Airborne landed on the roof of a church in Sainte-Mère-Église. He hung there, playing dead, while the battle raged in the square below him. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st, landed alone in a field of cows. He later quipped, "Never has so few been commanded by so many." But in the fog of war, this disaster transformed into a tactical miracle. The Germans were waking up to reports of enemy paratroopers. But the reports were coming from everywhere. A dozen men here, 50 men there, spread over hundreds of square miles. The German commanders tried to plot the attacks on a map, but it made no sense. There was no coherent pattern. Because the Allies were so lost, the Germans couldn't find them either. The confusion paralyzed the German response. They hesitated, unsure where to send their patrols, convinced that these scattered groups were just a diversion for a larger attack yet to come. Amidst the chaos, there were moments of surgical precision. At 0016 hours, 3 British gliders flying in total silence swooped out of the darkness toward the Bénouville Bridge, vital for protecting the invasion's eastern flank. The pilots, flying by stopwatch and moonlight, crashed their wooden gliders mere meters from the bridge defenses. The troops stormed out, dazed but alive. In 10 minutes of ferocious close-quarters combat, they took the objective. It was the first victory of D-Day. The prompt signal was sent out, ham and jam. Pegasus Bridge was secure. But as dawn approached, the chaos of the night was about to give way to the horror of the morning. The airborne troops had done their job. Now the eyes of history turned to the sea. Chapter 5: Bloody Omaha and Utah. To the west, at Utah Beach, the currents of the English Channel played a fortunate trick on the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. They pushed the landing craft 2,000 yards south of their intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., armed only with a cane and a pistol, limped ashore and realized the mistake. But he also realized the German defenses here were weak. He made the most famous tactical decision of the morning. We'll start the war from right here. The landing at Utah was a masterful success, costing fewer than 200 casualties. 10 miles to the east at Omaha Beach, there was no such luck. Omaha was a geographic trap, a crescent-shaped beach 4 miles long, overlooked by 100-foot bluffs. It was a natural amphitheater of death, and the German 352nd Infantry Division was sitting in the best seats. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the nightmare began. The pre-invasion aerial bombardment, intended to smash the German bunkers, had failed. The heavy cloud cover forced the bombers to delay their release by seconds to avoid hitting their own ships. Those few seconds meant the bombs fell harmlessly into the fields behind the beach. The German defenses were untouched. Then the technology failed. The duplex drive swimming tanks, the great hope of the engineers, were launched too far out in rough seas. One by one, the canvas screens collapsed. 27 out of 32 tanks sank to the bottom of the channel, taking their crews with them. The infantry had no armor support. They were naked. German MG-42 machine guns, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, opened up in a crossfire that swept the beach like a scythe. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Men were cut in half before they could step off the ramp. The water turned a deep, opaque red. The noise was a solid wall of sound, explosions, the ripping of canvas from the machine guns and the screams of the dying. Within 10 minutes, the first wave of the assault was combat ineffective. Company A of the 116th Regiment was virtually wiped out. Survivors dragged themselves behind the hedgehogs, the steel obstacles the Germans had placed to rip the bottoms out of boats. But the tide was rising. As the water crept up, the men were forced to move forward into the fire or drown. Robert Capa, the famous war photographer, landed with the second wave. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely change the film. His blurry, grainy photos are the only visual record we have of the chaos. They show men neck-deep in water, crawling through a grey hell. By 0830, the commanders on the ships offshore considered abandoning Omaha Beach. They couldn't see any movement. They assumed the assault had failed. But on the beach, something remarkable was happening. The plan had failed. The tanks were gone. The officers were dead. The radio men were gone. What was left was the raw will to survive. Small groups of men, rangers and infantrymen, realized that staying on the beach meant death. There was no strategy anymore. There was only the instinct to move. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, arguably the hero of the day, walked upright through the hail of bullets, chomping on a cigar. He found a group of terrified rangers huddled behind a sea wall. He looked at them and said the words that would become legend. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." Inspired by this insane bravery, a sergeant blew a hole in the barbed wire with a Bangalore torpedo. A handful of men scrambled through the smoke. They clawed their way up the bluffs, throwing grenades into the slit trenches, fighting hand to hand with the German gunners. They didn't take Omaha Beach with grand strategy. They took it inch by bloody inch. By noon, the guns on the bluffs began to fall silent. The Americans had broken the Atlantic Wall, but the price was catastrophic. Over 2,400 men lay dead or wounded on that single strip of sand. The water at the edge of the beach would remain red for days. Chapter 10. The Commonwealth Sectors. While the Americans were fighting for survival on the western beaches, a different story was unfolding to the east. Often overshadowed in popular culture by the drama of Omaha, the landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches demonstrated the sheer, grinding competence of the British and Canadian armies. Here, the lessons of the past had been learned, and the strange inventions of General Hobart were put to the test. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Division hit the sand at 07:25. The sea was rough and the Germans were waiting, but unlike at Omaha, the Funnies arrived on time. The flail tanks churned through the surf, beating the sand with their heavy chains, detonating mines and clearing safe lanes for the infantry. The petard tanks, armed with massive mortars, cracked open the concrete bunkers that blocked the exits. It was a triumph of engineering over fortifications. Within hours, the British had pushed off the beach and were driving inland, capturing the town of Bayeux with surprising speed. Further east, at Juno Beach, the Canadians faced a much darker reality. The 3rd Canadian Division landed on a sector heavily fortified with sea walls and bunkers. The rough seas had delayed their arrival, meaning the tide was higher than expected, covering the beach obstacles. Landing craft were ripped apart by mines hidden just below the surface. The first wave took 50% casualties in minutes. It was a slaughter that nearly rivaled Omaha. But the Canadians fought with a grim, relentless fury. They didn't stop. They stormed the sea walls and engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting in the coastal villages. By the end of the day, the Canadians had not only secured their beach, but had advanced further inland than any other Allied force, nearly 7 miles deep into France. They had cut the vital road between Caen and Bayeux. At Sword Beach, the easternmost flank, the British 3rd Division came ashore led by commandos. Among them was Brigadier Lord Lovat, who famously ordered his personal piper, Bill Millin, to play Highland Laddie on the bagpipes as they stormed the beach. Under the surreal sound of pipes, screaming over the roar of gunfire, they pushed forward to link up with the paratroopers holding the bridges. But it was here, in the gap between Juno and Sword, that the Allies faced their greatest threat of the day: the 21st Panzer Division. This was the only German armoured division near the coast that didn't need Hitler's direct permission to move. At 16 hours, they launched a counterattack. 90 tanks roared north, aiming to split the British and Canadian armies and drive a wedge all the way to the sea. If they succeeded, they could roll up the Allied line from the inside. It was the moment the German commanders had been waiting for. The panzers reached the coast, they saw the ocean, but as they looked out, they saw something else: the largest air force in the world. Allied Typhoon fighter bombers descended on the column. British anti-tank guns rushed ashore just hours earlier, opened fire. The German attack stalled, then broke. The panzers retreated. The last great hope of throwing the Allies back into the sea had evaporated. The line held. Chapter 7. The German Perspective. While the Atlantic Wall was being hammered by the greatest invasion force in history, the German response was paralyzed by a bizarre comedy of errors, ego, and bureaucracy. The failure of the German defense on June 6th began not on the beaches, but in a quiet house in Herrlingen, Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of the Atlantic Wall, the man who had obsessively prepared for this exact day, wasn't there. He had analyzed the weather reports for June the 6th. The storms were fierce. He concluded that no sane commander would launch an invasion in such conditions. So he took a few days of leave. He drove back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. He wanted to give her a pair of grey suede shoes. When the phone rang early that morning with news of paratroopers, Rommel was 500 miles away. But the paralysis went deeper. It went all the way to the Bavarian Alps. At the Berghof residence, Adolf Hitler went to bed late, around 3 a.m., having stayed up listening to Wagner and discussing mundane topics with his inner circle. He took a sedative to sleep. His strict standing order was simple: he was not to be disturbed for any reason. As the sun rose and the scale of the invasion became clear, the German generals on the ground were screaming for support. They knew that the static defences of the Atlantic Wall could not hold forever. They needed the panzer reserves, the elite armoured divisions held back for the counter-strike. But under the twisted command structure of the Third Reich, those tanks belonged to Hitler alone. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the supreme commander in the West, requested permission to move them at 04 a.m. He was told no. He requested again at 070 a.m. He was told General Jodl would not wake the Führer. So, while Americans were dying on Omaha and Canadians were bleeding on Juno, thousands of German tanks sat idle, their engines cold, waiting for a man to wake up from a drug-induced sleep. Hitler finally woke up around noon. He ate his breakfast. When he was finally briefed, he didn't panic. He was euphoric. He believed the deception. He thought this was the trap he had been waiting for, that he would crush the Allies on the beach. He didn't release the panzers until 4 p.m. It was the fatal delay. By the time the German tanks began to move, it was late afternoon. The skies had cleared. The Allied air forces, which ruled the heavens, spotted the columns moving in daylight. They decimated them. The tanks that could have turned the tide of the war were turned into burning wrecks before they even reached the battle. That evening, Field Marshal von Rundstedt spoke to the High Command in Berlin. When asked what should be done now that the Atlantic Wall was breached, his answer was icy and realistic. He didn't suggest a counterattack. He simply said, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" Chapter II's Conclusion and Legacy. As the sun began to set on June 6, 1944, the fires on the beaches of Normandy glowed against the darkening sky. The Allies had not achieved all their Day 1 objectives. They had failed to capture the city of Caen. The beaches were not yet fully linked. The foothold was precarious, a strip of land only a few miles deep. But they were there, and they weren't leaving. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress that Hitler claimed would last 1,000 years, had been breached in fewer than 12 hours. The spell of Nazi invincibility was broken, but the cost of that day is something that statistics can never truly capture. We know the numbers: over 4,400 Allied troops confirmed dead, thousands more wounded. Estimates of German casualties range between 4,000 and 9,000, but numbers are cold. They numb us to the reality. To understand the cost of D-Day, you have to walk the ground. If you go to Normandy today, above the sands of Omaha Beach, you will find the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. It is a quiet place. The wind blows off the channel, rusting the pine trees. And there, arranged in perfect geometric precision, are 9,387 white crosses and stars of David. They stretch as far as the eye can see. Each cross represents a universe, a father who never came home, a son who never graduated, a farm boy from Kansas, a teacher from Brooklyn. The average age of the men buried there is 24. Many were 19. They did not fight for conquest. They did not fight for territory. As the historian Stephen Ambrose wrote, they were the sons of democracy, sent to save the world from a tyranny that threatened to engulf it. They ran into the fire, into the machine guns, into the cold water, because they knew that the world behind them, the world of freedom, could not survive if they failed. The battle for Normandy would rage on for weeks. The fighting in the bocage, the hedgerows, would be brutal and slow. Paris would not be liberated until August. The war would drag on for another year. But the hinge of history turned on that single day. Erwin Rommel was right. It was the longest day. But when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the beginning of the end of the Third Reich had arrived. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. The story of World War II is filled with moments where the fate of the world hung by a thread. If you want to support the channel and see more documentaries like this, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the war would have ended differently if Hitler had woken up earlier? Or was the Allied victory inevitable? Let's discuss it below. Until next time.